everyone. I am Dani Gelardi. I am the senior soil scientist at the Washington State Department of Agriculture of soil carbon science, because I think we've been hearing a lot about soil carbon in the popular press. And my hope today is to present some of the basics so that we can kind of better interpret what's happening in the media and at the federal level, at the state level, so that we can make better informed decisions for our farms and for our farming stakeholders that are rooted in science. So this is a question I ask myself every day. It keeps me up at night. Where in the world is carbon San Diego? And that's in part because we know that atmospheric carbon concentrations are increasing. This is kind of what drives the mania right now over soil carbon. We are trying to figure out how to reduce the atmospheric carbon. And partly we do that through things like tree planting and vegetative planting. And that's in some ways kind of simple because we can actually see a tree. But today we want to talk about all of that invisible carbon beneath our feet, which is actually a larger pool of carbon than the plant biomass and the atmospheric carbon combined. And so just to define a couple of terms so we're all on the same page, soil carbon exists in many, many different forms. We tend to talk about this rich brown soil carbon, which is embedded in soil organic matter. That's the 1 to 5% of most agricultural soils that is made up of 58% carbon. And the rest of that soil organic matter is other essential plant nutrients, hydrogen, oxygen, all kinds of things. There's also inorganic carbon. You are probably familiar with caliche layers. This is also carbon, but it is a little less sensitive to management, and it only really occurs in arid environments. So generally, when we're talking about soil carbon, we are talking about soil organic matter. And so just to get through the fundamentals of how the carbon gets there to begin with, there is all of that atmospheric gaseous carbon circling around, and plants take that in through photosynthesis and store that carbon in their vegetative bodies and exude that carbon into the roots. And then from there, this kind of amazing process happens that we like to call the microbial filter, where the microbes use that carbon for different metabolic functions. They use it to grow their own bodies and to grow their population. And in the process, actually respire most of that carbon back out as carbon dioxide. So something like 3 to 33% of the carbon you put in will actually stay in the soil, either in microbial bodies or as soil organic matter. The rest is respired back out. So you see that it's kind of a cycle here. And so just to define a couple of terms, you hear carbon sequestration a lot. That is what this process is called, the process of taking carbon down through plants and having it mediated by microbes into soil organic matter. The carbon sequestered minus the carbon lost is called carbon storage. And that's what we're trying to increase. We're trying to increase carbon in and decrease carbon out. And so another way to look at the carbon cycle is that your microbes are using soil organic matter like a battery. And they are both depleting that battery and charging that battery based on where we're at in the carbon cycle. So they deplete the battery in a process called carbon mineralization, where they use it to, again, power their own metabolic needs, and in the process provide all of these ecosystem services. Obviously, we are here because we care about food production and all of the different agricultural services that are required for that, things like nutrient cycling, water storage, pest and disease resistance. But soils also do a lot of other things for biodiversity habitat and water filtration and air filtration. And of course, they charge the battery through that microbial filter process that I talked about earlier. So there is a lot of evidence that shows low soil organic matter soils can actually be increased in soil organic matter through agricultural management. However, on the whole, since the history of agriculture began about 12,000 years ago, there's a lot of evidence to show that overall agricultural soils have been substantially depleted in soil carbon. In fact, this paper here shows that we have a debt from agriculture, something to the tune of 133 petagrams. And to put that in perspective, that first figure I showed that there's 800 petagrams of carbon in the atmosphere. So something like an eighth of that used to be in our soils. And through agriculture, we have exude that and put it up into a gaseous form. And that happens through two different pathways in agriculture. So the first is that we reduce our inputs. And this has largely been driven through crop breeding techniques. Modern crops have been optimized for vegetable production or grain production or bigger fruits and less roots, less shoots, less stalks. And so what that means is that there's just less carbon being returned to the soil and more being exported. And furthermore, through management, we tend not to leave a lot of that excess carbon in the soil. So this may be things like bundling up your crop wastes and burning them. It may be things like selling the excess to a paper pulping facility, which of course is great secondary revenue, however, does remove quite a bit of carbon. And then also agriculture tends to increase the carbon going out. So things like tillage exposes carbon to the atmosphere, and then oxidation, it increases the microbial respiration of that carbon. Things like leaving your soils bare, of course, erosion can take that soil, that topsoil and the carbon off with it. Even things like irrigation can leach soluble carbon through the soil profile. So there are a lot of different ways that we both reduce inputs, increase outputs, and of course, this leads to decreased storage overall. But of course, there's hope. There is a lot of different practices that you can use to increase the soils, the carbon in your soils. And we are all familiar with the sort of regenerative agriculture or soil health or carbon farming practices. We want to minimize soil disturbance, maximize diversity, keep the soil covered, maintain a living root, and integrate livestock when possible. And you've already heard a lot about these practices today. But I want to just talk about how it's not quite so simple to just recommend these practices and assume that they will uniformly increase carbon in all conditions. Because we know that soils are incredibly diverse. There are over 20,000 soil series in the United States. And that means that even within a single field, there's going to be a lot of variability in how your soils, if and how your soils can store carbon. Things like texture and the minerals in your soils will dramatically alter the ability of your soils to store carbon. There's this idea of a carbon saturation point, where based on texture and mineralogy, even your regenerative agricultural practices will experience a sort of plateau in how much carbon you can build. And that's in part because, of course, all of the diversity that I mentioned, but also because stoichiometry matters when we're talking about soil organic matter. So you may remember from high school chemistry where you learned that even if you have enough bread to make 3 ham sandwiches, if you don't have enough ham, you cannot make 3 ham sandwiches. There's a limiting factor. And that can happen with carbon and soil organic matter. You may put in enough carbon, but if you don't also have phosphorus and sulfur and some of those other nutrients, a lot of that carbon will be respired. And finally, we know that increases in soil carbon are not permanent. They can be reversed through a few seasons of intensive management. Furthermore, some of this is just beyond our control. Heat domes or a well going dry, things that are unexpected can take all of your hard work and reverse it. And so when we talk about regenerative agriculture, I think it's really important to not be prescriptive and say these will increase soil carbon, but that they have a very good chance of increasing soil carbon. And that even when they don't increase soil carbon, there may be other just as important services that they provide. So I really do like to talk about soil health and not soil carbon, because carbon is not the end all be all of why we care about soils. Could guarantee that all of those practices increase soil carbon in all conditions. There's still a lot of questions about how to even measure it. I think Ryan really teed this up well by showing those really variable graphs and when you sample, how you store your samples, whether or not you take bulk density so you can actually calculate carbon stocks. All of this really matters when we're talking about quantifying the carbon in your soil. And of course, this matters when we're talking about carbon markets. And I think Chad and Wolf will talk a little bit more about that after. And so just to kind of go over the highlights of where we're at in sampling and being able to quantify this, obviously we can take samples in the field. You've probably all done this. You go out with a shovel, you send it to a lab, you wait a few weeks and you get a result. And the pros of this are that you actually know what's in your soil. But the cons, of course, are that it's pretty labor intensive, it's pretty cost intensive, and there are a lot of decisions to make. How many samples do you take to account for the variability in every field? How deep do you go? There's a lot of evidence that shows most of your carbon is really, really deep in your soils, but we tend to only sample to 12 inches or maybe 6 inches. And so one of the ways people get around this is instead to model soil carbon. Modeling is a really swift and inexpensive way to estimate what's in your soil, and luckily someone else has already done the work, so you really just need to plug in a few numbers. But the models themselves have a lot of variability. Are they including current climate or future climate? Do they have crops that you're growing? Were they based on data sets from your region, or was the data that built the model from somewhere totally irrelevant to your system? So it's important to remember that when you use a model to estimate your soil carbon or the effect of the practices that you're interested in, they are just estimates. There are some really cool new technologies coming online. So here's a picture of a probe from a company called Yardstick, where you can actually take this probe into your field, push it down to 3 feet, and get instant soil carbon measurements. So you don't have the lag time. You can take as many as you want in the field. And so this is a really promising way to get around some of the time and labor intensity of field sampling. However, it's a new technology. You're not likely to see these at the Tractor Supply store anytime soon, and I'm not sure what they will cost when they do get there. Remote sensing is another kind of interesting combination of some of these technologies. You're probably familiar with remote sensing from NDVI, where they're looking at crop greening and trying to understand more about plant health. They're trying to apply the same technology to estimate soil carbon. So in fact, there's actually a team at WSU. Haley is a part of this team. I'm working sort of tangentially with them to try and estimate soil carbon from the sky. And of course, that would be very, very convenient if it works. But there are a lot of questions about if you can only estimate the top 2 to 5 inches, is it really valuable for cropping systems or for carbon markets? So with all of that complexity, it's understandable that it's pretty hard to figure out how to build programs and policies to encourage people to increase soil carbon. And one of the first choices you have to make, which I'll talk about now, is whether or not to pay for practice or pay for performance. A lot of the NRCS programs you saw introduced earlier have taken the pay for practice route, where they're going to issue a payment for a practice to be implemented on a field, whether or not it leads to the outcome of increased soil carbon. Pay for performance, on the other hand, is where you are contractually obligated to have your soil perform. You will not be paid perhaps until that carbon has already been built in your field. And again, someone else will talk about carbon markets a little bit later. I think Chad and Wolf will. But I do want to talk just a little bit about some of those pay for practice options, independent of the NRCS ones that were mentioned earlier. So a very popular alternative to cap and trade for soil carbon is what we call cap and invest. And these have been adopted in California and in Washington, where you cannot trade your emissions at your factory for new practices on a field elsewhere. The recognition that soil carbon is complex, it's difficult to manage, there's lots of different social and economic and scientific barriers, has led to people instead investing in carbon with the revenue from greenhouse gas emission allowance sales, but not actually trading them. So another way to think about this is you are not on the hook for increasing soil carbon in your field in exchange for greenhouse gas emissions. However, you will be paid for the practices through the sale of those emissions. In Washington, there's the Climate Commitment Act, and there's a lot of kind of confusion around how agriculture is or isn't involved. To be clear, soil carbon is not an eligible offset in this market. Instead, all of that money is raised, and then these are some of the eligible practices for that revenue. Things like methane capture at dairies, things like soil and fertilizer management, or on-farm solar energy. And so far, just in the first year of the Climate Commitment Act, some programs that have been funded are the Compost Reimbursement Program, where we reimburse 50% of the cost of your compost up to $10,000. The Saving Tomorrow's Agricultural Resources Program. This is a sort of branding initiative that connects producers who are implementing practices to different supply chain partners and economic opportunities. And then Sustainable Farms and Fields, which are, again, another pay for practice, climate smart grant source. So again, I always like to just remind people carbon is not the end all be all. Soil health is also really important, independent of carbon. We don't want to miss the soils for the soil carbon or the forest for the trees, because soils are just the best. They provide so many services beyond just climate mitigation.
Hi, I'm Wolf. I've been working in carbon markets for about 18 years, 15, 18 years, something like that. My first project I was on was actually a no-till project in 2008 under the CCX, which is the Chicago Climate Exchange, which is sort of defunct, but it was the first effort for carbon at that time. When I was on the farm, oh, the price went down. It was 7 cents a ton. So now we're getting around $20 a ton. So 2014, I started Evergreen Carbon as a DBA out of my consulting practice because I had some direct experience. I really thought these carbon projects are really neat. And I thought it'd be great to get these projects out to everyone or anyone. So I'm going to start. I was in Africa on a project that is basically using the same methodology that you can use here. So from Eastern Washington to Eastern Africa to Kenya, see in the lower half, those are the cattle that they raise. And they raise them amongst the wildlife that's there. So there's no fencing, but they had issues, of course, with water management and overgrazing. And during droughts, a lot of their animals would die. So they instituted this carbon project to manage the grazing practices, to allow wildlife to flourish, as well as being able to raise a certain amount of cattle, and sheep and goats is the other livestock, and they call them shoats because one shoat or one sheep or one goat has equivalent carrying capacity on the land. So they just lump them together as shoats. And I thought, I was just fascinated. And you see in the upper kind of right, the herds person, the herds woman is in the pink, and she's herding her goats and sheep. And part of the project validation to make sure the project's going to go, we have to make sure that everyone's doing their job. And so even the herdsmen to land managers to all kinds of different people get interviewed, and data is captured, soil data is captured as well. So I thought it'd be kind of a nice place to start, is starting in Africa. So I'm going to talk about the frameworks of carbon markets, some trends. I can't really talk about everything, and a little bit about the requirements of the methodologies themselves if you're going to look at carbon as another cash crop, which is, there's a risk involved, but if we do it right, we actually can recognize some of this as a cash crop. And Dani was right that Washington State doesn't accept carbon credits from soil projects, at least not right now. But again, the money from the CCA will flow down to farmers to buy equipment and other technical consulting and information. So I kind of put this together. This is kind of what maybe an international carbon market frameworks. Now, we have like these international markets and projects that are recognized and protocols that are recognized. And I call them real with a capital R. And there's other folks out there who, I have a great way of doing this. I'm going to sell the carbon credits, but they're not getting them registered. There's no control. They set up a website, you put your credit card in, you don't know what you're buying. So there's these private markets, and then there's these public markets. So I have focused on public markets. Not that all private sellers of carbon credits are a scam, but there's a danger. There's more likelihood without the controls here. So I don't know which is the pointer, but so we have a set of international standards. The ISO 14064 Part 2 describes how carbon projects are put together. And then there's the set of organizations, they're nonprofits. These are greenhouse gas registries like Vera or Climate Action Reserve, which is also called CAR. Um, and these registries are responsible for publishing the methodologies, for managing the registration of these projects, providing oversight and guidance. And then the development of the projects can usually are done by an organization, a company that's expert in doing that, or people can kind of roll them up themselves. There's enough technical expertise in this room to easily carry off the carbon project. I'm absolutely sure of that from what I've been hearing. Some of the principles are completeness and consistency, transparency and conservativeness I've underlined, because this what I like about market are transparent. The data, the reports are available for anyone to download. So you can see how your neighbor did a project, you can do the same thing. So excuse me, so lots of data and documents. The Flourish folks have started gathering data. That data management is really important to carbon projects. And then we'll bring in a third party to validate the project at the start, and then to verify the carbon credits after the project has been running for a year or two. And the registries, provide the governance and the infrastructure that basically map out specifically what needs to be done, what attestations, what documents have to be created in order for a good project to happen and for them to be registered. And then you get the carbon credits, and after the verification, and then they could be available for sale, and you can get money for those, which is like the best part, right? At the end. So on the green side here, we have, carbon credit sales, and it's just any business. You write contracts, you decide you can write a future contract, you can find someone who's going to want to buy your carbon credits now. You don't have them yet, you won't have them for 3 years, but they will sign a contract and guarantee the sale at a certain price point, which gives you confidence to go forward, right? Those types of forward contracts, or just selling them on the spot market through a broker or a trader. And then these carbon credits, these real ones, they're fungible. In other words, they can be bought and sold actually multiple times before they're retired. They can only be retired once. So the end user, the carbon credits, will ask or retire them. In the meantime, a broker might go out and buy a tranche of 500,000 carbon credits and find the buyers. And like the farmer here in Eastern Washington may not have the relationship with, a corporation in New York or something to actually sell those carbon credits if they're interested. So the brokers and traders, they provide an important function, and everyone gets, a little bit of margin as they get sold and resold. But that's okay, that's business. You got to pay for someone's expertise in order to do that. This is kind of a project timeline. This is right out of the ISO standard. You're going to kind of assess what the project is, the feasibility. You're going to design the project. You're going to create the project, the description documentation, and get it validated, get it registered. Your project starts going forward, and you do testing and modeling, as Dani was talking about, to describe soil carbon. And then you get the amount of soil that has accumulated, and you can verify that. And then you get your carbon credit. So basically, if you're going to start a new practice today, you probably have like 2 years to get your project registered with a registry. So so when you start these practices, think about the timing, know the protocol, know the methodologies, and then kind of decide what my project start date is going to be. A lot of these projects, like the one in Africa, is a group project. It started out with 3 ranches in Kenya, but they're going to move to other countries. They'll be all in the same project. So here's kind of some trends Um, so many of these little circles here, I can probably talk about an hour in each one of these. But there's new tools and analysts out there who are analyzing carbon market, what kind of uptake, what pricing is going on, market management, that type of thing. There's been some negative press in the market as well. If one project goes south, then someone writes about it, and then they just damn the whole thing and say, oh, these carbon credits, carbon markets are not worth anything. Well, they are worth a lot, and they're important because just we need to draw down the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So to sequester carbon where it hasn't been sequestered before, and turn something that where we're losing and adding carbon to the atmosphere, turn around that and to sequester the carbon, I think is a really good thing. So if one project goes south, maybe the baseline was wrong or something like that, or someone doesn't like it and they have a bone to pick, and there's a bad article, and it's so the industry, is moving towards integrity, and so in greater quality and greater focus and more attention to detail. So there have been like funny carbon credits out there, like solar panels from China. It's like, they sell those carbon credits, but it's sort of business as usual with renewable energy, with wind and solar right now. But so we don't get carbon credits for those anymore, right? Because it's business as usual. If all the farms practice these agricultural practices, then there wouldn't be carbon credits available because there's business as usual. So the idea of a carbon project is to create a sustainable way of doing agriculture going forward that's beyond business as usual, and it's additional. So additionality is important. And so if we all start today, we haven't done the additional practices. If we wait 20 years to start, all your neighbors are going to already be doing this. So you're not going to get carbon credits. So timing is everything. On this, Dani mentioned about data, about modeling, artificial in intelligence is kind of at the fore, some new modeling, but there are successful models out there now that people are using that has the inputs. What's driving it is corporate ESG, which is the environmental, social responsibility of corporations. And they said, well, we got to buy some carbon credits to for our own marketing purposes, that type of thing. Innovation, carbon finance, where's the money coming from? A lot of discussions here have been talking about different grants and funding from different organizations. Those grants and fundings can't support a carbon project. The only thing you can't do, you can't sell your carbon credits twice. So you pick a registry and you go with them and go with that methodology. You can't double dip. Yeah. So here's some core principles. So the Integrity Council and the Voluntary Carbon Market has kind of put together these principles. And they've been these ISO principles since I started this, since 2006, 2008. These principles have been there. Why the Integrity Council and Voluntary Carbon Market is like they're basically repeating what's already in the ISO standards. So, but apparently not everyone has been following those standards as well as they could. And so they are kind of describing on specific project types what the integrity would look like. So some of these principles, the additionality, now the permanence is sort of like we need to permanently store that carbon. You can't store it for 5 years and then build a house on top of it or dig it up or do something else. So you have to have a long-term agreement. And you might be shocked, agreements like 100 years would be like the best case, but you can have shorter term agreements as well, or re-up these agreements after 10 years, you get revalidated and you continue forward. So the permanence in agriculture is considered on a long timeline in forest and in agricultural practices. So yeah, it's a little bit different than other more of the industrial type projects that actually would destroy methane, that type of thing. So I'm getting a warning here on time. Yeah, so the new practices we talk a lot about here: water management, fertilization management, tillage, that type of thing, crop rotations, integrating grazing practices. And so just picking on a couple of those. So improves fertilizer management has a list of things you can be doing. Improves crop planting and harvesting has another set. Some of these terms I am not a technical expert, so I don't know, but you guys know. So we work together to develop the carbon project itself. We have to think about our baseline, what we've been doing the past 5 years, 20 years, and then figure out what we're doing. So we have a baseline here. We have the new practice and the difference between the carbon sequestered from the baseline and what your new practice is doing. That's where your carbon credits are from. So when you do a point source at 12 inches, you have to look about the carbon contained within the whole acreage. So you do that calculation. Other project boundaries, you have to look at your fossil fuel use, your lime use, those types of things, fertilizer, biomass. Yeah. And so this is just me here talking. So there is a referendum out there you're going to be seeing in November that wants to repeal the CCA. The CCA has raised like $2 billion so far. And a lot, I don't know how much of that, but a percentage of that, still a lot of money, is going into farms and fields. So if you repeal that, then that money will be there for us, right? So it's important that the CCA is like really sophisticated as far as a piece of legislation. The one thing that they do have is a thing called a direct environmental benefit. And again, the soil carbon is not one of the methodologies, but they want anything to be focused on Washington State. So good and bad for different reasons. The co-benefits are listed by the UN. These are things like when the carbon finance comes in, use that money for different purposes. And then when you have these SDGs, these sustainable goals, they make the projects more valuable. So if you're a corporation buying a carbon credit and you see a lot of SDGs that are associated with those carbon credits themselves, even though they might be verified separately but they're not, they're not quantitative, they're qualitative. But having those say, you can talk about that. Well, we built a school with that carbon finance. We improved childhood health outcomes. Those types of things show up. In the last couple of slides, up in the North Andes, again, using similar methodologies of soil carbon, they're planting trees where trees don't grow. So we'll see how they're done, but we interview farmers, we understand how the land is being managed. And this lower left was like hanging out with the kids in this one-room schoolhouse, and they haven't seen an iPhone. They don't know what they look like on the screen. So what caught me on these carbon projects is that they are the confluence of sustainable practices, community, and societal gains. And these all can be wrapped up in a carbon project. And that's why I kind of love those projects. And so I thank you. I have a lot more to say, but yeah. Please. Right.
So what?
Right. So if you do if you're doing like no till currently, and you've been doing that for 5 or 8 years, And then you add like nutrient management or grazing or agroforestry. So if you stack another sustainable practice on top of what you're doing, then you get all the carbon credits that's there. And so you look at your baseline numbers and then you add your new practice, and that additional carbon would be where your carbon credits come from. Yeah, you can go to the actual greenhouse gas registry like Vera and look up projects. And you go to the project registry and you click on any particular project, and you can click on view the documents, and you'll see verification reports, attestations, other documentations that were created that's required by the registry in order to substantiate the carbon project. Yeah, vera.org maybe, or climateactionreserve.org. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so that is a big hill to climb, to overcome. So you have to be confident in the methodologies. You've been farming this land for 100 years. Can you farm it for another 100 years? Can you do it for 20 years? So you have to have some agreement, and the carbon credits will be kind of prorated as amount of time you put it in the ground. And so again, we don't have absolute permanence. So the land has to be under some easement or some agreement that substantiates that it's going to continue to be farmland for the right amount of time. But that is something to overcome and to talk about. But yeah, you have to take that risk and say, yeah, I think I'm going to leave this land to my kids, and they're going to continue this practice. I can sign a long-term agreement with the registry itself. You violate that agreement, then you got to pay for the carbon that you agreed to, that was sold, but now it's gone, right? So there is some risk there. Yeah.
I had zero agricultural background until I started working for ag tech, selling guidance stuff about 2011. I've grown from there, have my own company. 2020, I got asked to sell actually and become part of a channel partner per se, a dealer for a cup. It was Yara started it. Now it's Agoro. So my job was to go and talk to growers about becoming part of their carbon program, which kind of got touched on. A lot of the stuff is very similar and all that stuff. So there's actually inside of Agoro's program, we actually have 42 growers inside the Pacific Northwest. That's ranchers and row crop that are actually following some of this stuff that's been kind of touched on. I'm going to go over kind of not real quick because a lot of it's kind of been done, but it'll be kind of what they kind of look at. So Dani brought up kind of what a carbon offset is and a carbon credit. She's exactly right. These companies that we'll show here pretty soon are looking for that carbon credit. They're looking for you to bring on an additionality, whether it's from ranching or farming. And then they'll go in and then they'll run tests. It's like Wolf brought up, there's a baseline test. Then there's another test depending on what their contract or what they've presented to Vera, the company. Agoro actually uses Vera. So if they create a contract that goes for 5 years, they're going to go take a baseline test in year 1, and then a test in year 5. They're going to figure that number out. Now, a lot of these guys use the NRCS program that was built from Colorado State on how they're going to pay you, because they go and they take the moisture that we have, the type of crop, all this stuff, what the predicted carbon number should be. It's a very, very, very conservative number. That's what they're going to pay you on a per ton basis. Our area varies anywhere from, if you go into no-till, varies anywhere from 0.18 to about 0.3. That's also taking off the 20% payoff. So if you're getting paid $10 per se, let's make it quick, there's already a 20% taken off of that for what Wolf kind of mentioned was the permanence. So in where we have a lot of our farm ground, especially in the United States, it's very hard for us to say that you're permanently going to have that ground. If you guys go down to the Tri-Cities, I have a lot of clients in the Tri-Cities. You go on the south side of 395 on Kennewick, the amount of houses that have gone in there now that were actually, that was even irrigated ground, that was pivots. So it wasn't even dry land. A lot of those places are being built on, because it's quicker to make it, you're making a crap load of money, you're at the end of your farming life, it's easier to do. So in those types of case, that's where this 20% is. So these companies, these private companies are running it, they're already paying and taking off that 20%. So for that reason, that doesn't mean it's going to happen, but that it's creating a bank is really what it's doing. The carbon potential, here's your major players that you have right now, and it's growing by the year, by the month, actually. These are the guys that kind of got into it. I would say Indigo is kind of the leader at the start. They're also the leader on being able to sell credits. Last year, they sold credits at $40 a ton. 75% of that went back to the farmer. So the farmer was getting $30. That was 200% more than they prepaid the grower. So the grower was actually making money. Like I said, I work with a grower, so I have a good idea on what the process is there. From the testing standpoint, the data collection standpoint, it is very intense. It's very, I shouldn't say it's very intense. The front end of it is pretty heavy. The back end of it's no different than if you're in an NRCS program. Nori got touched on a little bit about, I don't want to say, and I'm not calling any of you guys out because they did it, but it wasn't just because they weren't fully looked down upon or looked on, is that a lot of these companies up here were selling non-certified credits. So they would go in, they would take these, basically they were paying you on your past. If you'd gone in Terra, there's a handful of growers in this area that actually signed up for Terra 2 years ago. So what they did was they said, say 2018, I was conventional since 2018 to 2020. I went no-till. They paid them on past credits. They paid them on that past stuff without doing any testing. They just paid them on taking the NRCS number off of car out state, and that's what they paid them. Now, when that credit, that's a non-verified credit. So when that credit gets taken to the market, it's not worth the same. So it's basically like if you go in, since we're in the ag industry, you go in and you want to buy beef. It's the same. It'd be like the grades on beef, on how you get paid from that. It's the exact same kind of a deal. So the verified credit, Agoro, again, I know I work with the Agoro side of it. So Agoro goes in. We actually had Vera come out this fall. Went out and verified ground, talked to about 15, 16 growers, walked the ground, looked at the ground, looked at all of our documentation, checked it off, made sure it was all. So now that was the baseline of the verification process. Every year we turn in that document, except for running an NRCS program. We turn that stuff in, it gets checked off. Agoro's job is to check that off, and then come year 5, Vera will go through and do the same thing. A new program in the Northwest, it's picking up. It's big in Montana, a little bit in Canada, is Nutrients program. Nutrients program, what they're trying to run is more based on looking for nitrogen stabilizers. So, and microbial build. So that's kind of what they're based off. It is available here. And like I said, it's bigger in Montana. I know one of the main guys that has been head running that, and they have a lot of traction. Basic program guidelines is kind of touched on a little bit. Each one of them the top of it is pretty much the baseline side of it. You have to make an additionality change. Okay, so there has to be an additionality, whether that a lot of them aren't just looking at a change in your nitrogen, or unless it's by 1%. So you're looking at like a 5% reduction in nitrogen to be able to get into it. 5% in our dry land is pretty tough. 5% in irrigated ground, if you do it right, it's pretty easy to hit. Okay, but in dry land across depending on what you're doing in a year to year. Now it's not a year to year because a lot of them have a sunset clause. So like we've been dry the last 3-4 years. So obviously our nitrogen usage, the guys that I use on what I use with so I do a lot of variable rate data management for growers, and we've not variable rated a lot in the last 3-4 years because we haven't needed it. We've been so dry, and if we have, it's just by we've actually flat rated quite a bit. But you have to do an additionality. So moving from conventional to even minimal till, a lot of these programs, they're not run like the NRCS. It's not a stir factor. It's an actual reduction in passes. So if you're a conventional guy and you have 8 passes, 3 of those passes are a rod weeder, you take those rod weeder passes out. and you add a chemical. It's the full reduction because of the CO2 outage. The length, you have 3-year, 5-year, 10-year contracts as your base contracts. Some of those contracts pay you up front. Some of them pay you on a per year basis. Some of them don't pay you until the end. It's all dependent on how that contract, what the company is doing, but most of them have a year-to-year payment because they want to entice you to keep doing what you're doing. The pay, like I said, it's a lot of them, most of them are per year. Some of them have sign-on bonuses. Those are the ones that you probably want to try to get in on because they're more than anything, they're signing you on to keep you for that 3 to 5 year contract. The ones that we run, they're a 5-year contract with the ability to get opt-out. Sign-on bonus at that time when it was coming on was pretty good. So you were able to make changes to your drills or tractors or sprayers or whatnot. Forecast in the future, like you said, Indigo last year sold at $40 a ton. It was great to hear the cap and credit market change because the biggest thing that my growers right now and we have issues with is this isn't like a commodity. This isn't something that you can pull up on DTN and see the current price of today. It is very hard to find out what the actual price is. Even that sell, I can make 3 calls to 3 other companies and they all give me a different rate of what they're hearing from the people that are selling or buying it. It's more than anything, it's who's going to buy it and who's going to sell it. So it's the broker side of it gets pretty tough. The voluntary market growth in 2020 was $4 billion. Projected to be by 2050 is 90 billion plus. The more on that same side, and currently there's 500 million tons bought. By 2030 is 1.5 billion. The biggest push from the United States, and this was going on during the Trump administration, the biggest push that's going to come from the United States is from outside of the United States. When you talk about Canada, you talk about the EU, you talk about all these other countries that we export to, when they start putting in a carbon tax and forcing us to have some sort of carbon program in place or paying those tariffs, that's when that's going to get passed down to us. And as we see with the CCA in Washington, we're getting an extra tax. You're getting a pass down tax from the trucking companies for anything that you're buying right now, fertilizer companies or anything like that. So these programs aren't built just on a soil health side. It's going to come a point in time, as we know with our input prices coming in, whatever you can get from these programs is a little extra to knock off some of the offsets as well. Here's your top 20 companies responsible for your emissions in the world. These are the companies that a broker would be going to and asking them to say, hey, buy these credits. We have these credits from Washington that are all from the farmers and ranchers, creating a backstory and trying to sell these credits to. As you can see what kind of industry they're in, those industries aren't going away. That's just the bottom line. There's my contact info. Like you said, kind of wanted to just an overview. Dani and Wolf really touched on a lot of good stuff. Not that we didn't really overlap all the time, but a lot of that stuff is pretty pertinent and pretty important. So
the question was about retiring credits, like when do they get retired? So credits are live and they can be traded. Again, if they're within these capital R real markets, and if they're retired when the owner of the credit says, I want to retire these credits. So usually kind of at the end of the year in late winter, I've done the greenhouse gas accounting for my company. I want to offset like 10% of that carbon footprint. I'm going out and buying carbon credits, or I own them. I will retire them permanently to offset that portion.
Okay.
Before they retire.
You know, if I'm going to be someone that incentivize me to retire, but potentially get that tax right forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the tax incentives around that, but if that's, I guess you could do that. According to Chad's numbers, I think the carbon credits are worth more than to just arbitrarily retire them. I would want to sell them. So Agoro as a aggregator of different farms, so they can sign the permanence agreements for long term, and farms can enter and leave their program after their contract is up or re-up their contract. So going with an aggregator is kind of a smart deal as a grower.
I would say that the biggest thing is that, as we talked about, or as I mentioned, is the verification of your credits. So like right now, we're out taking samples to verify these credits. And we're pulling, and depending on how big the acreage are, we're pulling anywhere from 8 to 16 different locations on each field that's been created. Like Danny talked about how the modeling. So this Agoro has a science team that's modeled for our area, created points. It's not all done off of yield or anything like that. Just these random points. That's why it's so randomized in these fields. We take that in now. The cost of those samples to get verified plus the hours, I would go on a limb and say you just going out and doing it yourself, you're not going to make money. That's why it's a bulk sell. And then you have the paperwork and the amount of like just to start up, get 6 guys in here. We want to start our own company to get that company get up to a registry point to be able to do that. I think the cost would be astronomical. Now you could take a company like Highline or something. If they wanted to try to do that in the back end, they could. That's the reason why most of these major players are backed by a chemical company, because they're going to be the ones that are going to need these credits. I don't know in the back, but my guess is that Yara has a back door with Agoro on when these credits come available, being buying these credits because they're production plants.
Great, great. They start out lower.
Mhm.
Doing a lot of things. All of that. Amount of dollars.
The question was if you made your changes from the start to the end of the contract, whether it's 5, 10 years, how much the pay increase is. Is that correct? If you've done this. So like I said, all we have right now to go off of is the model from Colorado State. And if you've gone from full conventional to say no-till, like I have guys that are in the horse oven. So I have guys in the dries that dries can be. And you're looking at probably the increase of going, I think they're like they're one of the ones that I think if I remember right, 0.18. And they have a chance to be about 0.27. And that's from a very conservative 0.32. So you're looking at a very small. We do have a company around here, if you guys know who Shepherd's Grain is, that has been in a program now for I think 6 years. So they had actual testing done. So I've seen the numbers out of the Highway 2 corridor, and the increase from their start to their finish is a lot higher than those conservative numbers. Now it's a little bit wetter up here, but still from those practice changes, you take 1% off of what it would be. Like I said, a lot of these companies use very conservative numbers because they're paying you. So the hope of it is when we get done in 5 years that we're actually, when we see this, that we're actually making some sort of money on the back end. You're looking at right now, a lot of these companies are in from $16 to $20 a ton. So then you're just timesing that, say times that by a quarter a ton. And then that's what you get per an acre. A lot of these companies know in our area, they have to be some sort on a payout of what a CSP program is, an RCS program, to get anybody enticed. That's why in the Midwest, it hasn't taken off, because when you take the Midwest and you're down to 1,200 acres, $16 a ton, $20 a ton, when you're doing about 1.2 tons, that's pennies on the dollar for the Midwest, to make complete changes from a strip till to no till.
So, and Chad, that's 0.18 or whatever per year.
Per acre per year.
Per acre per year.
Per acre per year.
So
until it hits like Dani showed that we flat mine out. That's the biggest problem we have right now with guys that are trying to get in these programs that have been no-till for 10 to 15 years, is trying to find the additionality stuff. And that's where Vera's very new to the ag industry. They've been in the forestry industry for years. We were some of the first clients up here that Vera actually came up to do on-site verification. They just not in the ag industry. So creating these standards, and that's where Wolf mentioned all this stuff is on. You get on Vera, you're going to be able to see all the projects. There was billions of dollars put in this new climate program from the government that Oregon State is getting like 18 million. WSU's part of it, Idaho's part of it, to where they're going in there. You can get online and see what these programs are of this additionality that can help. And that's obviously for our no-till guys, it's going to be huge. Is it nitrogen stabilizers? What can we get to this level?
Yes, my question, Danny mentioned, um, what? Scenario. Or they, I mean, it's the ecosystem services and potential valuation of. So what do you guys see is carbon the NLP? What do you see in the markets? I can just take a quick pass at that and then hand it over to Chad. So there is a lot of efforts right now to. Oh, yeah, the question is about whether or not, or it was just sort of the status of valuation of other ecosystem services in addition to carbon sequestration. There are a lot of efforts going on in that space right now. I think the ecosystem service consortium market, ECMS, is sort of pioneering some of that work. I think probably anyone in a conservation districts who worked on a voluntary stewardship program knows how hard it is to actually quantify some of those benefits. I think there's a lot of work to do there. So if we think carbon is complex, some of those other biodiversity measurements or other ecosystem functioning, I think it's really challenging to put a dollar on that. So there are efforts, but I'm not sure they're that sophisticated yet.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, so additional co-benefits will enhance the price of the carbon that you're getting, or it's coming from this project. You don't want to kind of lose where the project is coming from and what's going on the land. But it's hard to quantitate. It's a very transparent marketplace, except for pricing. It's the only thing you don't know. You know everything else. You just know how much the carbon credits are going to cost you, or the money you're going to get back from them. I think Chad wants to contribute. Yeah.
I think this even goes further than just the soil health or the carbon side from a farmer standpoint, or even rancher standpoint. It becomes being more efficient and put more money in your pocket. It goes back to the six, 7 passes. I'm doing all these rod weeders. With the price of equipment right now and inputs right now, you need to find ways to become more efficient. And in the end of that, by doing this, your soil gets healthier. You become less dependent on chemical companies and inputs. That way, that in the back end of it's going to put more money in your pocket, operating costs. Because I mean, we're at a point right now, if you can't figure that out, we have farms in our area 5 to 10 years that won't be in. They'll be working for somebody else. That's just really where it's going to come.
You know, want to say I've been to actually several fertilizer plants. One plant might be 4.3 million metric tons a year of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. So you can take that fertilizer and put it on the ground. And so we don't know what that carbon accounting is through the whole supply chain unless you actually roll up your sleeves and do it. So moving to nutrient management, you know, you don't have to pay for the chemical fertilizers, but understand that production of chemical fertilizer is a very carbon intensive, greenhouse gas intensive process. I think it's important to group projects because the cost that it takes to develop a project should be shared, and larger project, it's easier to sell larger amounts than like 10 and 20 credits. And I'm sure as an aggregator, Chad can talk more.
Are you talking about building a project? You're talking about signing on with a company? Okay. Yep. So you want me to repeat the question? So
Yeah.
the question was if it's cost effective to go on your own to create a project or to go with a big group such as Washington Grain Growers or whatnot to create that project. And from an individual standpoint to sign on with the company, they do have minimum acreage. Some are 250, some are 500 acres. From a standpoint like Wolf touched on, that if you're going to build like Shepherd's Grain, part of them going to it was because of their model of what they're trying to sell. From a marketing standpoint, that if they, they want to be, it's all conservation, it's regenerative ag conservation. So adding that moniker, that check mark makes their product more valuable. From the end of it, like Wolf touch again, repeat what Wolf said was, if you want to get into something like that, it would be wise if I was on the Washington Grain Board or something like that, or even or Pacific, one of the co-ops in the area, getting everybody on board to do that and then start from ground zero to create a project. That would be the best. Then you're selling a story too. Like you said, everything is selling a story. You can get Google, go online or go on, create a commercial that they bought X amount of carbon credits from the great farmers of Washington. And we've reduced this. Now it's a feel good touch story. We're all going to Disneyland type story. So,
And I'd go on to say that as a group project with many different farms, each farm can do their own practice. They don't have to do the same practice everyone else is doing, though some of those will become more common practices because you're in the same ecosystem here. So third-party validation and verification, they're conducted by a separate company that has independence, competency. They have a management system that supports that competency. The question was, why not partner with a verifier? Okay, so the verifiers are independent. So they're hired by the project developer, but they're independent and they need to be independent. And these third-party verifiers are accredited to do that work. So the verifiers get verified. So the auditors get audited. And one of my long-term contracts is I work for the ANSI National Accreditation Board, ANAB, who certifies third-party verifiers. So I audit the auditors in the field. That's what brought me to Africa and to Louisiana, wherever I happen to be, to do this kind of work. So they need to be independent. They don't buy or sell. If you get verified, they're not part of the carbon sales or anything like that. They're just affirming that you're meeting the methodology and your project description documentation that describes what you're going to be doing. And then, and then your monitoring reports that are annual reports that Chad mentioned, they'll verify those as well. And then they sign off and say, okay, these carbon credits are real. The registry will review all the documentation and agree with it, and then create those carbon credits essentially out of thin air on a computer someplace. Well, it's not someplace, it's a major database management by another third party actually manages the carbon credits. They're integrated with the registries, but they're separate. So the registries might get like 5 cents per carbon credit, but if you sell them for $48 or $24, they're still getting the same 5 cents. So they're independent. They just want the projects to be well done, of high integrity and high quality. Does that answer?
Question would be who think of the end person of who runs that program and what they get from people that can buy credits as an offset. Why would they want that to happen? Does that make sense? So who buys the credits? These companies, corporations up there, right? If they're not on the market and they can't buy them, then what are they paying? They're paying that tax, right? That would be the connect the dots that I would do from from my standpoint. I'm not saying that's right or wrong or what it is. But so you run all these conservation programs that no one's going to get carbon credits for. Now you've taken yourself out from additionality. And so private markets have a chance if that all happens, that the private market price goes up. So but that would be my connected dots in the circle.
I guess, oh, I have a last question. Somebody. Verification department. Is there a situation like that?
Experience in that.
Yeah, I don't know if there are specific instances that I can explain. So, but these carbon methodologies, soil carbon, they were published like the end of 2020. So, and they're in revision 2, so they're not that old. But again, the verification fails and say, hey, you're not meeting that. Then you don't get the carbon credits, they don't sign off. So what happens? There's kind of a risk there involved, right? So you got to be doing it right. Yeah, and so if you also have agreements, so how do you say it? Agoro? Agoro has agreements with Vera in order to provide these types of this project, right? Made of a group project. So if any one of his farmers fails to do what they said they're going to do, he'll have other farmers that will make up for it, and they'll come and go and leave the program, his program. But yeah, there is some risk involved. So if all his farmers fail and they already sold a bunch of carbon credits, well, they have an agreement. There's also a buffer process too. So Vera's going to charge you, 7% or 20%, depending on what you're doing. So the amount of carbon credits you create, they're going to hold back some for the buffer. So if any one forest project fails or agricultural project fails, then this large buffer made up of credits from all the contributors from all the projects in nature-based, those credits would then be retired from the buffer. And depending whether it was an act of God, a natural thing, or drought or floods, then the buffer will take over. If it's something that the farmer did, they sold their land and tilled it up and built houses or something, then it's kind of a man-made and they have to pay back that money and out of their pocket. Yeah, it's part of the agreement. So you got to be really sure. So that's why there's a lot of planning that goes in executing an agreements and attestations. It's pretty legal. So you can be sued if you screw up, if you do it wrong, and if you refuse to pay. Yeah.
On the site, we're so new in this area, Aaron, that the only numbers I have is sit down with the growers that I know from Shepherd's Grain. And like I said, Colorado State is the baseline of what all these companies are using for the predicted models. And if the Shepherd's Grain numbers are right, I think we're okay in our area. So we're so new to it. There's, like I said, Indigo is the first one to take credits to the market, and they got paid extra, and there was no kickback, or they haven't released that they didn't hit their mark. So I would have to say that the conservative numbers that Colorado State is putting out is saving these companies. I hope to see some test results here coming back pretty soon, and then you and I can have a beer and we can look over them, or 2, 6.
Yeah. So the way the model will predict the amount of soil carbon, then you have to ground proof it. So you do have to do some soil sampling, but not extensive soil sampling, because sending those samples to the lab are expensive. So you have a good model. So the common model from Fort Collins is one. There's one called Rock C is another one that's being used. And AI is being created now. Some new methodologies using remote sensing and some other these newer tools. So we're kind of nascent in soil carbon as far as monetizing it, but now it's a good time to start talking about it like we are.
The censoring that Dani showed it's coming, because it's going to save a lot of money. Like I said, there's a lot of money in the soil sampling, and the stuff that Dani showed it's coming. It's already being tested. It's part of new projects. They're 1-year, 2-year projects. So it's on the way.